Hey guys, it's Max. Welcome to my comparison between the brand new iMac Pro versus my 2017 5K iMac. Now in this video, we're going to talk about things like configuration, prices, who this machine is for, thermal throttling, but we're mainly going to focus on video editing with Final Cut, which I think is a huge selling point for this machine. You have video editors such as myself who are using Final Cut, so we're tied into the macOS ecosystem, and we want a high-end computer that's going to do a fantastic job with high-end video editing. So to start off, let's talk about prices. This is the base model, which comes in at $5,000. It has the 8-core, the Vega 56 8GB graphics card, 32GB of RAM, and the 1TB SSD. Now on the other side, I have my iMac, which has the i7 processor, RX 580 graphics, and it has 32GB of RAM right now inside of it. I took a little bit out. I'll talk about that in a second. And I also have a 512GB SSD. So if you compare both models and you're going to get the same RAM and the same SSD, you're looking at $3,700 for the iMac, and then you're looking at $5,000 for the iMac Pro. So what do you get for that extra $1,300? Is it worth it other than the performance? Well, you get the same display, you get the same kind of keyboard and mouse. Of course, we have a little bit different colors, and we have the numeric pad on the new iMac Pro's keyboard, but we also get double the Thunderbolt 3 ports, and we get 10 gigabit Ethernet as well. You can get 10 gigabit Ethernet with an adapter, but you end up using one of your Thunderbolt 3 ports, so you only have one left on the regular iMac, and it's going to cost you about $300 for that adapter. So those are definitely things that could be worth it for you, even if you don't look at performance. Now the iMac Pro now also has a dual fan cooling solution, which sounds a little bit funny if you're from the PC side, where we have tons of fans in our systems. They run loud, but they run cool. So Apple had to revamp the cooling solution to be able to support these Xeon chips going from 8-core all the way up to 18-core and the two different graphics cards, and it does run much quieter. Now you do miss out on something as well. You can no longer upgrade your RAM, which definitely does suck. I understand why Apple did it. They didn't really specifically explain why, but if you look at the design, if they would have put in an access door to access the RAM that's now more than twice as large, since they're using full desktop length RAM sticks that are upgradable if you can open up the iMac, but if they put in a trap door in there, they'd have to seal it off, and that would mess up the airflow inside, and they really need that airflow because the machine's basically the same size, but we're packing a lot more power and a lot more heat into it. Now, along with that, we have those larger sticks because you can upgrade it all the way up to 128 gigabyte compared to 64. Now, the cool thing is on the iMac, even though we're saying it's a $1,300 difference if you're speccing it out the same, you don't have to buy that $3,700 configuration. Personally, I have no need for 1TB of SSD storage. I have so much videos, so much clips and projects that even if I had, the super overpriced or super expensive 4TB internal drive, that would be nowhere near enough for the projects that I do. I think most video editors are in a similar way. We're using external RAIDs, we're using servers or lots of drives in order to handle all of our projects. So if you don't need that 1TB, you can go with the 512 like I did. And since we have a user accessible and upgradable RAM slot on the back, you can get the base 8GB version model, which is what I did, and then add your RAM yourself, meaning you can get that machine for $2,700 and maybe spend another $300 or so and actually get 40 gigabytes of RAM. You add in two 16 gig sticks. Starting off the benchmarks, we're going to take a look at Cinebench R15, which maxes out the CPU and kind of gives us some raw performance numbers. Now on our iMac, which is a 4-core, we have a score of 930. Our iMac Pro, which is an 8-core, gives us a score of 1682. So we have roughly 80% more performance, which is perfectly in line with where it should be. Next, let's take a look at Geekbench 4. This is a cross-platform benchmark that doesn't really max out your CPU, but it does some photography stuff, some compression, some rendering, a wide variety of tasks. So here in the single core, the iMac is faster because it has a higher boost clock, and it has a score of 5,736, which is really good, and it was really impressive when that machine was updated back in June. Now, the iMac Pro got 5,088. Now, Now, this is impressive to me. Typically, you're looking at the Xeon processors, and yes, they have a lot of performance if you're using all of the cores, but if you're looking at single core performance, they're always much slower than the iMacs. So here, yes, it is slower, but it's not that far off. This means if you're using programs and doing simple tasks like surfing the web, different little things like that don't use a lot of power, you're still going to get snappy performance in regular use. Now in multi-core, we have 19,744 and 31,159, so roughly 60% faster speeds with the iMac Pro. Now let's take a look at graphics performance. So for OpenCL, we have roughly 35% higher score on the iMac Pro, and for metal rendering, we have roughly 40% faster with the iMac Pro. Now to test the 3D performance of the graphics, I ran Unigine Heaven, which is an old benchmark, but there's tests for tons of systems, so it's really good to compare if you're looking back at older systems here. So we have roughly 75% faster 3D graphics performance with the new iMac Pro. Finally, let's get into Final Cut, and let's start off with Bruce X, which is kind of a graphics rendering benchmark designed for Final Cut Pro. You could download this little file and run the test yourself. So if you want to compare these systems to your system, go ahead and just search up Bruce X online, download it, and follow the instructions to see how it performs. The iMac Pro was rated 15.5 seconds to render the 5K scene versus 17 seconds on the regular iMac. Now let's look at my standard suite of benchmarks. I have a couple different projects that I test cross platform, and this helps me to be able to compare with multiple systems, even 1 or 2 months afterwards. Of course, when we have a new release of Final Cut, the old numbers aren't really valid, and I did see a big performance increase with the new Final Cut with this iMac behind me. Sometimes even twice as fast on some projects, and maybe 35 to 40 to 50% faster in others. So do keep that in mind when you're looking at the performance between these two machines. So we're going to start off with stabilizing a 4K 20-second clip. Now the iMac behind me did it in 7.5 seconds, stabilizing a 20-second clip. This is insane. It used to be 8.5 seconds with a previous version of Final Cut, and this is really, really fast because it's maxing out that graphics card and almost maxing out the processor. This enables it to just render it really fast and get it done, compared to somewhere between 2.5 to 5 minutes if you're using DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro. The iMac Pro took 13 seconds. Yes, it's slower. It is slower. It took 13 seconds. I did this test multiple times. What's weird, and this is going to be like a common theme, is instead of almost maxing out the CPU and literally maxing out the graphics, it only used about 40% of the graphics. It wouldn't use any more, and the CPU was roughly 30 to 40%. Now let's take a look at a 5-minute 1080p project with 2 LUTs and film grain applied. I am using the built-in LUT loader now that Final Cut supports LUTs without having to use plugins. Our iMac took 2 minutes and 37 seconds to render the scene and to encode it into H.264 compared to 2 minutes and 3 seconds. So that's about 28% faster. Not a huge difference, but we definitely do see it. Now let's take a look at the same exact project, but in 4K. Here, the regular iMac finishes in 3 minutes and 14 seconds, and the iMac Pro takes 4 minutes and 2 seconds. Yes, the iMac Pro actually took longer. Now, there are a few reasons why. First off, the iMac Pro is not using all of the system resources, whereas the iMac is cranking up its fan speed all the way because it's getting really hot. It's, thermal throttling a little bit. It's maxing out the graphics, close to maxing out the processor, whereas this thing, the processor is working at 30, 40, 50%. The graphics is only working at about half. The fans are literally silent because they're not kicking up because they don't need to, and we're getting slower performance, which is unfortunate, and hopefully this will be updated or optimized in the future. Apple had a lot of time, like I said. They just released this brand new updated Final Cut, so you think it'd be prepped for this machine, but it doesn't seem that way. Now, the second reason is something called QuickSync. This is a specific chip that's built into the integrated graphics in the consumer lineup of Intel processors, the chip that we have in this iMac, and that chip is designed to encode H.264 single pass video. So that way the processor can handle its own tasks like decoding and sending data to the graphics card and receiving that, and this chip can make that little video file, and it speeds everything up and allows Final Cut to export video really, really quickly compared to the competition. Now, the Xeon processors have never had those chips built in, and unfortunately the iMac Pro doesn't have it as well. So it's gonna suffer in that aspect. Now, as you saw, it is slower, but it's not that much slower. I honestly expected it to be slower in this regard without QuickSync, but it keeps up fairly well, whereas older Mac Pros, like the trash can and the one before that, took much longer compared to iMacs and MacBook Pros, even though their performance and the actual editing was much better compared to those machines. Now let's take a look at the most difficult project. This is 4 4K files with LUT and film grain applied, 2 files reversed, and all of those are crammed into a single 4K timeline. With the iMac, that thing took 30 seconds. 30 seconds. It used to take like 1 minute and 16 seconds, which is already really fast compared to Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve, but with this latest update, it's cranking using all the hardware, getting it done really quickly. The iMac Pro took 36 seconds, not much slower, but it is slower. So at this point, I'm starting to get a little bit disappointed, but I understand we have QuickSync on this machine and we were rendering to H.264 video, and this is kind of a more simple benchmark. So I really wanted to get into a more difficult project, something that's much longer, much more complex, different types of media, lots of corrections, and lots of side-by-side 4K footage, something that's really gonna give the iMac Pro a chance to shine. I went ahead and opened my 34-minute 4K A7R3 review. Now I started off exporting this with the background rendering turned on, so all the files were pre-rendered to ProRes, and all the system really had to do is take all that ProRes and encode it. So in this test, I expected the iMac to be faster because of that QuickSync. The iMac Pro took 16 minutes and 8 seconds, whereas the iMac took 15 minutes. Now this is actually really respectable because if you're editing off of an older Mac, let's say a trash can Mac, this would be more like 30 minutes on the trash can Mac versus 15 minutes here. So the H.264 encoding is quite efficient with these new Xeon processors, even without QuickSync. Now the next thing I did is I deleted all the pre-rendered files. So now we have to decode H.264, we need to render all the effects, color corrections, any changes that we have, titles, stuff like that, and then we also have to encode the file as well. So the iMac is still using that QuickSync chip to encode it, but it does have to work a lot harder with all of those 4K files. With this version of the test, the iMac Pro took 22 minutes and 25 seconds, about 23% longer than with this whole timeline pre-rendered. The iMac, on the other hand, took 17 minutes and 46 seconds, about 19% longer. So this was impressive. I was expecting the iMac to take longer or slow down more than the iMac Pro because it has a lot less raw horsepower, even though it has that QuickSync chip, but it slowed down less, so it had less of a performance hit without having that timeline pre-rendered. Next, let's take a look at the same type of a project without any sort of pre-rendering, but we're gonna export to ProRes, so the iMac is no longer gonna have that QuickSync chip advantage. So here, the iMac Pro took 17 minutes and 16 seconds and did this task virtually silently, whereas the iMac took 19 minutes and 32 seconds. So the iMac did take longer, but not by that much. That QuickSync chip advantage isn't that great. So to finish off with this project, I wanted to render the whole timeline without any sort of encoding, and this is going to look more at the graphics performance and use a little bit less of the CPU performance compared to when you're encoding a file. So here, the iMac Pro took 14 minutes and 58 seconds, where the iMac took 17 minutes and 18 seconds, so we are seeing some of that raw performance come through. Now the next thing I took a look at was HEVC, or H.265 video editing performance. And what was interesting is that even though it's more difficult to edit, so a lot of people convert their files, Apple was showing off that this latest iMac Pro does a much faster job with these files compared to the previous computers. Now the first thing I tested was rendering out that 5-minute 4K project with 2 LUTs and film grain applied, which is H.264 footage from an A7S II, but encoding it to H.265, which would allow us to maintain the same level of quality, but have file size that's half as small. Now here, the iMac Pro took 5 minutes and 55 seconds to export. The standard iMac took 10 minutes and 42 seconds. So now we're seeing the iMac Pro is over 75% faster at this task. So I guess it is more efficient with H.265. Unfortunately, not a lot of people are using it right now. I think the vast majority of people are doing ProRes work or H.264 work, but this is kind of the future, especially for people who are going to be shooting HDR and exporting HDR video. The next thing I tested was basically the same project, but instead of using A7S II footage, I used H.265 footage from my NX1, 4 minutes 52 seconds versus 8 minutes and 55 seconds on the standard iMac. So both machines got a little bit faster, not having to convert from two different file formats, but once again, we have a good improvement with the iMac Pro. The last thing I tested with this project is just doing background rendering, 2 minutes and 16 seconds with the iMac Pro versus 4 minutes and 41 seconds with the iMac. So this thing is a little bit more than twice as fast doing that. So I guess if you're dealing with H.265 footage and you want to edit that, the iMac Pro really is taking a big win in this scenario. Unfortunately, there's not that much people that are doing that yet, but that will increase in the future. Now, before we get into some Red and Canon RAW footage, I want to touch on timeline smoothness. Now, this usually isn't a big issue for Final Cut because it's well optimized and it's quite smooth. And with the latest Final Cut update, it's gotten a lot better, even better than it was. So previously, I could probably handle, I don't know, 3-4 LUTs with film grain at full resolution 4K and have it be buttery smooth without any drop frames. With the latest update on the regular iMac, I brought it up to I think like 12 LUTs and it didn't care. The image got super messed up, but it was still super smooth, and the same thing goes for the brand new iMac Pro. Now, what I did find is on that 4x4K project, which typically doesn't even play back on anything, the iMac regular one is actually playing it back smoother. It's still not smooth, but as you guys can see side by side, the iMac Pro is a lot more choppy. And then of course, if we take a look at our system resources, the regular iMac is using more of its graphics and CPU power and kicking up the fans. So that was very interesting to see that the timeline performance with such a heavy, crazy project, the regular iMac is handling it better. Now let's get into the Red RAW editing performance. Now I started off with some 4.5K RAW footage from the Red Raven, and playing it back on the iMac, we get a bunch of dropped frames. You're not able to play back with the full quality setting. You can drop it down to better performance, which does noticeably decrease the quality of the footage, and I would not want to be judging focus with this setting, but you can edit it and you might get a few dropped frames, and then you can still add some corrections and stuff like that, but it's not great. I would not want to buy this system to edit footage in this way. Now, taking a look at the iMac Pro, even at the full, better quality setting, full resolution, we are not having any drop frames, even adding a LUT on there, some corrections, it's playing it back perfectly smooth, which is great. Now, I took a 5-minute project with some LUTs and film grain applied, and I exported it with a master ProRes file to see how these two compared. The iMac Pro did the export in 6 minutes and 45 seconds, so not much slower than real time, and the regular iMac did it in 33 minutes and 43 seconds, about 5 times slower than the iMac Pro. So not only are we having a tough time editing the footage, once you go to export it, there's a huge difference. 5 times. It's not 20% or 30% like we were seeing in some of the other tests. It's a lot. And now we're going to take a look at some 8K footage. So obviously, if we can't edit 4.5K RAW footage on the iMac, we definitely can't edit 8K RAW. And so even dropping it down from the full quality 8K in an 8K timeline to the better performance, still we cannot edit. Still too much drop frames, really choppy on the regular iMac. So I took that 8K RAW file, I threw it in a 4K timeline instead, and I dropped that down to better performance. The image does not look good. I would not want to edit this way. Still, we cannot edit this 8K RAW footage. I know some of you guys who have these high-end cameras that are trying to edit on the best iMac. It was a frustrating experience. You have to transcode to ProRes, which then you lose the capabilities of the Red RAW to change your ISO and all your other values. On the iMac Pro, on the other hand, in an 8K timeline, so no 4K timelines here, I know a lot of you guys do it that way, 8K timeline, we cannot do the full resolution 8K, so the better quality, But dropping it down to better performance, we are editing this smoothly without any drop frames, at least that I could tell. Even doing some corrections and throwing a LUT on there, we're still getting smooth editing performance. And what's interesting is since this resolution is so high, we're looking at 8K, even when you select that better performance aspect, instead of ruining the image and it being very soft with a bunch of aliasing like we typically get when we're in a 4K timeline, here in an 8K timeline, the image still looks super detailed. There's almost no difference, even on a 5K display, between the full resolution playback of 8K and that better performance setting. So it looks fantastic. You're gonna have no issues editing this way. You could see exactly what's in focus, and the performance is quite good. And this is on a base iMac Pro, not the 10 core, not the better graphics card or updated RAM. We're editing full 8K Red RAW in an 8K timeline with good performance. Obviously, I wanted to test out the rendering here, so we're doing a ProRes file. The regular iMac took 2 hours and 39 minutes and 42 seconds for a 5-minute 8K Red RAW clip, whereas the iMac Pro took 16 minutes and 52 seconds. So we have 16 minutes and 2 hours and 39 minutes. Huge difference. That's 10 times or more than that, the speed difference. So we're finally seeing a difference where the Pro and the iMac Pro is starting to come out. Now let's take a look at Canon Cinema Lite RAW from the brand new C200, which we can now edit with the latest Final Cut update. The iMac wasn't able to play it back at full resolution in a 4K timeline. It would start dropping frames. Now, of course, you can set it to better performance, but the image looks pretty bad. And once again, I would not want to edit in this aspect. And the iMac Pro, on the other hand, even at full resolution, 4K 60, with LUTs on there and some color correction to make that file look the way it should or a lot better. It's playing it back perfectly without any dropped frames. And of course, I took a 5-minute version of that and I exported it. It took 7 minutes 38 seconds on the iMac Pro and 8 minutes and 33 seconds on the iMac. So even with QuickSync, it does take longer. And then I ran the same test, but to ProRes, the iMac Pro actually was faster this way, 6 minutes 36 seconds, whereas the regular iMac took 11 minutes and 14 seconds, almost twice as long. Alright guys, so it's finally time for a conclusion. This video has gone on long enough. Is it worth spending the extra $1,300 or a bit more if you're willing to have less SSD space and tinker with the RAM yourself for an iMac Pro? Well, there's a few ways to look at this. If you're living in the here and now and you're editing H.264 footage and you really don't have a use for the 10 gigabit Ethernet or the extra Thunderbolt 3 ports, then I say it's really not worth it. The performance difference isn't huge where there is one, and in some cases, the iMac is actually faster. Now, we could get a Final Cut update in the future and get a little bit more performance with the H.264 out of this new machine, but that's not guaranteed. Apple had a long time with the software to get it ready for this new machine, and like we're seeing, there's not that big of a difference in performance. So in that case, probably not worth it. I wouldn't go for it. Now, if you're somebody who is editing that type of codec now, but you're going to switch over to H.265 in the future, since that is kind of what's going to happen, you are going to get better performance out of this machine. Obviously, if you edit raw footage, this thing is massively better than the regular iMac, and an extra $1,300 is well worth it just for the performance difference alone, not including the other improvements in the machine. Now, if you're one of the many people who will make a big investment into an iMac and keep it for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or even 8 years, I have talked to people who have had an iMac for 8 years, I would definitely spend the extra money on an iMac Pro right now. You may not see a huge difference in H.264 editing, but everybody's going to be switching over to H.265. There's great benefits, especially with the new HDR 4K shooting. You kind of need to have 10-bit H.265. So that's going to happen, and you're going to get better performance there. On top of it, if you do any raw editing, you're going to see a difference there. And overall upgradability, even though this thing is sealed where you can't access the RAM slot, it does use full RAM sticks, so you can get them installed, and you actually have a big roadmap of Xeon processor. So this is an 8-core, but you can buy all the way up to an 18-core. And what happens with the Xeons, as time goes on and they're replaced with newer models, the price comes down dramatically. So say 2, 3, 4 years down the line, you can spend $1,000, $1,500 and upgrade it to to an 18 core with 128 gigabytes of RAM, whereas with the regular iMac, it already has the best processor that it's ever going to have for that socket, and we're limited to 64 gigabytes of RAM. So if you're thinking long term and you're willing to do that or hire somebody to swap out parts in the future, I definitely will go with the iMac Pro in that scenario. So thank you guys for watching this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask in that comment section below. I will be putting out more videos on the iMac Pro. I may even get a 10-core Vega 56 version to compare to the base model, so definitely make sure you guys hit the subscribe button and enable those notifications. I will have links to both of these machines in the video description, so if you guys want to pick one up from B&H, you get the same warranty directly from Apple. You can add on AppleCare, that you get free fast shipping, and they don't collect sales tax either. And best of all, it supports more videos like this one. Thank you guys for watching. This has been Max, and I will see you in the next video.